A coat I had never seen in my life saved me from wanting to die. I was 15. 15. The age when you're supposed to be arguing with your parents about curfew, failing your first driving test, kissing someone behind the bleachers. Instead, I was lying in a hospital bed with a tube in my chest and a number on a chart that kept going in the wrong direction. The doctors had a word for what was eating me from the inside. I won't use it here, not because I've forgotten it, but because that word became the only thing people saw when they looked at me. Not the kid who could name every constellation in the southern sky. Not the kid who rebuilt a carburetor with his grandfather at age 11. Just the diagnosis. Just the number. But what happened during one of those nights in that hospital room made every doctor in the building question what they thought they knew about consciousness. And it started with a coat. Let me back up. I wasn't supposed to be sick. Nobody at 15 is supposed to be sick. But I mean that my body gave no warning. No slow decline, no suspicious lump, no months of feeling off. One Tuesday I was running track after school. The following Tuesday I was sitting in a chair while a man in a white coat explained to my father, not to me, to my father, as if I weren't there, that the mass they had found was aggressive, advanced, and had likely been growing silently for over a year. My father's face. That's what I remember most from that day. Not the doctor's words, my father's face. He was the kind of man who never broke. The kind who fixed the plumbing at midnight, who drove 12 hours without stopping, who never once in my life let me see him cry. And in that office, watching the doctor's mouth move, I saw something happen to his face that I had no name for. It wasn't fear. It was the look of a man being told that the one thing he cannot fix is the one thing that matters most. The months that followed were a slow erasure. Chemotherapy took my hair first, then my weight, then my ability to walk to the bathroom without someone holding my arm. I went from being the fastest kid on the track team to being the kid whose mother carried a plastic basin everywhere because I couldn't stop vomiting. My friends visited once, maybe twice, then stopped coming. Not because they didn't care, because they didn't know what to say. What do you say to someone your age who is disappearing? And the pain. I need to find a way to explain this. Imagine someone driving a hot nail through the center of your bones, not the surface, the center, and leaving it there, glowing, for weeks. That was my baseline. That was Tuesday at 3 p.m. That was every morning, every night, every breath. But the pain wasn't the worst part. The worst part was the theft. The disease was stealing my future, one plan at a time. The trip I was going to take with my friends after graduation? Gone. The girl I was too shy to talk to? Gone. Learning to drive, choosing a college. All of it erased from a timeline that kept getting shorter. And one evening, after a round of treatment that left me so weak I couldn't lift a glass of water, I lay in that hospital bed staring at the ceiling, and a thought arrived that I couldn't push away. What if this is all there is? What if I close my eyes and there's nothing? What if 15 years is the whole story? That night, my body gave out. The monitors started screaming before anyone could reach me. I remember the sound. A flat, continuous shriek that cut through the quiet of the ward like a blade. I remember a nurse's hand on my wrist. I remember someone shouting numbers that didn't sound good. And then, a sensation I will carry with me for the rest of my life. The pain stopped. Not gradually. Not the way painkillers slowly muffle the edges. It stopped, as if someone had reached inside my chest and flipped a switch marked off. 3 months of relentless, bone-deep agony, and in a single heartbeat, it was gone. All of it. Every last trace. And in its place, rest. The deepest rest I had ever known, deeper than sleep. A stillness so complete that the concept of time dissolved like salt in warm water. I wasn't aware of anything. Not my body, not the hospital, not my name. I simply was not. And that absence of everything was the most peaceful thing I had ever experienced. No dreams, no thoughts, no darkness even, because darkness implies something watching the dark, and there was no watcher, just an absolute, weightless rest. The kind of rest my body had been begging for since the first needle, the first scan, the first time I saw my own blood in a tube labeled with a number instead of my name. And I need you to hear this with precision. I was not in heaven. I had not gone somewhere. I was asleep. An unconscious sleep so total that 1,000 years could have passed and it would have felt like nothing, because it was nothing. A pause, a mercy. But what came next was the opposite of nothing. And it changed every single thing I understood about what waits on the other side of closed eyes. And then, in what felt like the next breath, the stillness cracked open. Not with sound, with light. A silver light, not white, not gold, silver, that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. And it didn't illuminate the space around me, it became the space, as if the darkness had been a shell, and the shell was hatching, and what was inside was something alive and ancient and impossibly real. I was being given something, not shown, given. A compressed package of understanding delivered directly into the center of who I am. Not through my eyes, not through my ears, through something older than both. A window flung open onto a future so vivid that my 15 years of life suddenly felt like a rough sketch drawn in pencil. And what I was seeing now was the finished painting, in colors no pencil could ever produce. The silver light didn't fade. It deepened. And I found myself standing, though standing is the wrong word, because I had no sense of weight or ground, inside a tunnel. Not a dark tunnel. A tunnel made entirely of that liquid silver light, as if someone had hollowed out a moonbeam and invited me to walk through it. And at the far end, I saw a figure. A man. Tall. Standing perfectly still, as if he had been waiting there for a very long time and was in no hurry whatsoever. He wore a long coat, a heavy, old-fashioned coat that reached past his knees, the kind nobody wears anymore, with wide lapels and deep pockets and buttons that looked like they were made of dark brass. The coat was charcoal gray, but with a faint herringbone pattern that became visible only when the silver light caught it at certain angles. And I knew him. Not the way you know someone from a photograph. Not the way you know a face because someone described it to you. I knew him the way your lungs know air. Instantly, automatically, without any process of recognition. He was my grandfather. The man who died 4 years before I was born. The man I had never met, never heard speak, never touched. And yet, standing in that silver corridor, I was more certain of his identity than I had ever been of anything in my 15 years. He didn't speak much. His face held a calm that seemed older than the tunnel itself. And when he opened his mouth, the words didn't travel through the air. They arrived inside me, fully formed, as if they had always been there, and he was simply unlocking them. Everything will be all right. 4 words, that's all. And I wanted more. Desperately. I wanted him to explain what was happening to me, why I was sick, whether I would survive, what any of this meant. But he said nothing else. He simply looked at me with eyes that carried a warmth I can only describe as the opposite of loneliness. And in that look, I understood something the words alone couldn't carry. He wasn't comforting me about the cancer. He was comforting me about everything. About the fear of not existing, about the future I thought had been stolen, about the question I had asked the ceiling the night before. And then the tunnel opened. Not at the end, but outward, as if the walls themselves dissolved. And I saw what was beyond. And what I saw out there is the reason I'm telling you this story. Because it answered a question that millions of people carry in silence. And the answer is not what anyone expects. The Earth. But not the Earth I knew. Not the Earth of hospital corridors and waiting rooms and machines that beep when you're dying. This was the same planet, but remade. Rebuilt from the ground up as if someone had taken the original blueprint, the one before anything went wrong, and constructed it fresh. The sky held a depth I didn't know was possible, a blue threaded with veins of molten amber that pulsed gently like a heartbeat. The air didn't just enter my lungs, it repaired them. Each breath undid something, a layer of nausea, a residue of fear, a scar I didn't know I was carrying. And the first thing I noticed, before the fields, before the rivers, before anything else, was the silence. Not the silence of emptiness, the silence of a world where nothing is wrong. Where there is nothing to scream about, nothing to mourn, nothing to fix. A silence that felt like warm hands pressing against both sides of your face and saying, "Rest now." Then the landscape unfolded. Fields stretched out in every direction, the grass luminous, as if each blade was lit from within by a tiny ember. Trees so vast their branches formed arching canopies overhead, casting shadows that felt like shelter rather than absence. Rivers ran through the valleys, water so transparent it seemed to barely exist, revealing beds of smooth colored stones. And flowers. Flowers that opened in hues I have no names for. Petals that seemed woven from concentrated light. And the animals. This is the part that caught me off guard, because I wasn't expecting it, and because it hit me harder than almost anything else. They weren't hiding. They weren't cautious. They moved through that renewed world with the freedom of creatures who have never known a cage, a leash, or a reason to run from anything. Enormous horses with coats that shimmered like burnished copper thundered across the meadows in groups, their manes flying, their hooves striking the ground with a rhythm that felt like music. Dogs, dozens of them, every shape and size, weaved through the crowds of people, tails swinging, noses pressed against any hand that reached out. They didn't belong to anyone. They belonged to everyone. They drifted from person to person like living gifts, and wherever they went, laughter followed. A child sat cross-legged in the grass, while a pair of golden retrievers rested their heads in her lap, and she giggled with a delight that seemed to radiate outward in visible waves. Cats stretched on sun-warmed boulders, watching the world with that ancient calm only they possess. Birds of colors I cannot describe. Feathers that shifted between teal and violet and something beyond both, landed on outstretched arms with no fear, no hesitation, as if the distance between species had been a misunderstanding finally corrected. But it was what I saw next that made my 15-year-old heart feel something it had never felt before, not even in the healthiest days of my life. I saw children opening their eyes, not children waking from a nap. Children opening their eyes for the first time, tiny, perfect, whole, in the arms of women who had never been allowed to hold them. Mothers who had carried an invisible wound for years, sometimes decades, were running across those glowing fields with arms outstretched and faces transformed by something so far beyond happiness that the word feels insulting. And when they reached those babies, when their hands finally closed around the small, warm, breathing body they had ached for, something happened to the air itself. It thickened with a presence I can only call completion. And I understood, without anyone telling me, that those mothers would raise those children. Every bedtime story, every first step, every scraped knee, everything that had been taken would be given back, with interest. And I saw the old rising. People who had closed their eyes, frail, exhausted, consumed by time and disease. And here, in this moment of restoration, their eyes opened new. Not tired eyes, not clouded eyes. Eyes blazing with the energy of someone at the peak of life. Somewhere around 30, with skin renewed, backs straight, muscles alive. And they ran. They ran toward the people who had been waiting for them, and the embraces that followed seemed to contain entire lifetimes of missing, compressed into a single grip. And through it all, my grandfather stood beside me, silent, patient, letting me absorb every detail. And when I turned to look at him, I saw that he too was restored. Younger, stronger, radiant, but still wearing that coat. That unmistakable coat with its herringbone pattern and brass buttons, as if it was his signature. His way of saying, "It's me, and I am real." And that's when the vision turned inward. Because in the middle of all that beauty, that staggering, impossible beauty, I was confronted with myself, with the person I had become during the months of illness. And the picture wasn't kind. I saw a 15-year-old boy who had turned his suffering into a weapon. Every time my mother brought me food I couldn't eat, I answered with silence or irritation. Every time my father sat by my bed, trying to find something to say, I stared at the wall and gave him nothing. My friends stopped visiting, yes, but the truth I hadn't admitted until that moment was that I had pushed them away first. With sarcasm, with bitterness, with the unspoken message that their healthy lives were an insult to my dying one. I had made my illness the center of the universe. My pain was the only pain that mattered. My stolen future was the only tragedy worth mourning. And standing in that corridor of silver light, seeing a future where every broken thing is made whole, I understood something that cut through me deeper than any needle ever had. You begged me for answers, but you stopped listening the moment the answers didn't sound the way you wanted. It wasn't spoken in anger. It arrived with a tenderness that made the rebuke sting more, not less. The way a parent's quiet disappointment hurts more than shouting ever could. And I realized that even at 15, even trapped in a body that was failing, I had a choice. Not about the cancer, about how I treated the people who showed up for me despite the cancer, about whether I would use my remaining days to build walls or bridges. I saw my father's face again, but this time not the broken face from the doctor's office, the face of a man who drove to the hospital every single day, who slept in a chair that was too small for him, who brought me magazines I never read and sandwiches I never ate, and never once complained. Never once said, "I'm tired." And I had rewarded that devotion with silence and resentment. The years we have, I understood this now with a certainty that was almost physical, are not the final chapter. They are the rehearsal. And what matters in a rehearsal is not whether you deliver your lines perfectly, it's whether you show up with your heart open. A single, "Thank you, Dad," spoken with honesty carries more weight on the scale that actually counts than a lifetime of accomplishments that never touched another soul. And then, my grandfather moved. For the first time since the vision began, he stepped closer, and he placed his hand on my shoulder. A hand that felt more solid, more real than anything in the hospital had ever felt. And I knew, without him saying it, that the window was closing. That what I had been given was a preview, not a destination. There was a reason my heart was still beating in that hospital bed. There was something I hadn't done yet. Not something grand or world-changing. Something simple. Something that started with the words I had been too proud and too angry and too sick to say. But here is the part that no doctor, no nurse, no textbook can explain. And it's the reason my father hasn't stopped telling this story in the years since. And then, the snap. Violent, immediate, like being pulled backward through a narrow pipe at impossible speed. The silver light collapsed, the warmth vanished, and I crashed back into my body with a force that drove every molecule of air from my lungs. The pain returned, but muted, as if it had lost its authority. The fluorescent lights buzzed above me. The pillow was damp with sweat. The monitor was beeping again. Fast, urgent, alive. A nurse stood at the foot of the bed, her face frozen somewhere between shock and disbelief. And beside her, in the chair where he had spent every night for 3 months, was my father. His eyes were red. His hands were clasped together so tightly the knuckles were white. He looked like a man who had just spent the last several minutes preparing himself to lose his son. And the first words out of my mouth were not about the pain, or the monitors, or the tubes. I looked straight at him and said, "Dad, the man in the coat, he said everything will be all right." My father stared at me, His mouth opened, but nothing came out. He was wearing a long gray coat, I continued. Heavy, old-fashioned, with a herringbone pattern and dark brass buttons, and deep pockets. He had his hands in the pockets when I first saw him. My father's face changed. Not the way it changed in the doctor's office. A different change. Deeper, slower, as if something ancient was shifting behind his eyes. He didn't say anything. Not then. He just held my hand, and I felt his grip trembling. 3 days later, he came back to the hospital carrying a small envelope. Inside was a photograph I had never seen. A black and white image, slightly yellowed, with creased edges. It showed a man standing in front of a house I didn't recognize. Tall, calm expression, hands in his pockets. Wearing a long coat with wide lapels, a herringbone pattern, and buttons that, even in black and white, were clearly made of something dark and round. My grandfather. In the coat I had described, down to the pattern, down to the buttons, down to the pockets where he kept his hands. A photo taken 20 years before I was born. A photo I had never been shown, that lived in a drawer in my grandmother's house, in a box my father hadn't opened in over a decade. And when I looked up from that photograph, my father was crying. Not the restrained, jaw-clenched kind, the deep, surrendered kind. The kind that comes from a place so far inside you that it surprises even you when it reaches the surface. And he whispered, "That's his coat, the one he wore every winter. I buried him in that coat." Now I need to speak directly to you. If you're watching this and you're young, if the world is telling you that your best years are being stolen, that you're running out of time, that the timeline everyone else gets to live is being erased from yours, I need you to know what I saw with a clarity sharper than any scan or any diagnosis. This is not the whole story. Not even close. For everyone who has closed their eyes, for your grandmother, your father, your friend who left too soon, the baby who never got to stay, the pain is finished. It ended the instant their eyes shut. They are resting in a sleep so deep and so peaceful that 100 centuries could pass and it would feel like less than a breath. No suffering, no awareness of time, no loneliness, just rest. And the very next conscious moment they will experience, the very next sensation after that final exhale, will be that seam. The earth rebuilt, the body restored, arms reaching, laughter rising, a morning that never fades. I know some of you are carrying a weight right now that makes you wonder if any of this could possibly be true. I know because I carried it too. In a hospital bed, at 15, staring at a ceiling and asking the darkness if anyone was listening. Someone was listening. And what that compressed vision, that transmission of understanding sealed into the deepest part of me is this. The most valuable thing you can do with whatever time you have, whether it's 80 years or 15, is to search for the Creator. Not through a formula, not by following someone else's checklist, through an honest, daily, imperfect pursuit of the one who designed that future I was shown. To live in a way that prepares your heart for the moment of restoration, so that when it comes, you will be ready to receive the gift of standing again before the people you love most. This isn't about which building you walk into on a given morning. It's about the sincerity of your search, the stumbling, uncertain, sometimes desperate act of reaching for something greater than your own pain. I survived the cancer. Not easily, not quickly. There were months after that night when the treatment nearly killed me anyway, and the only thing that kept me from giving up was the memory of that coat, that calm face, those 4 words, and the photograph that proved, beyond any argument my 15-year-old mind could construct, that what I experienced was not a hallucination born of disease. It was a glimpse through a window that most people never get to look through. My father and I are different now. Not because I got better, because of what happened in the silence between a boy describing a coat and a man recognizing it. Something shifted between us that night that no amount of illness could undo. We stopped filling the room with the noise of worry and started filling it with the only thing that matters: presence. And now I want to ask you something. I want you to answer in the comments. Who is the person whose face you see when you close your eyes? The one you ache to hold again on the day when everything is made new. Picture them. Not as they were at the end, not in the hospital, not in the bed, not diminished by whatever took them from you. Picture them the way I saw them, restored, radiant, young, alive, running toward you across a field that glows with a light this world has never produced. That moment is not a wish. It is a promise written into the very architecture of what is coming, and it will be worth every single day you held on.